Americans aren't thinking about it because Americans aren't interested, in most cases, in what happens beyond the borders of their country. The bad news is that when you treat what happens overseas with sort of only casual indifference, you have a group of people in Washington who love manipulating and love exploiting our power for agendas that have nothing to do with American interests. And there is no American interest in a war with Russia over eastern Ukraine. None.
Yeah, and on that, the subject of the border issue and potential foreign agents within the United States, we seem to be having a lot of issues up here as well when it comes to swaths of fighting-age males immigrating to the country. And we're watching as closely as anybody can these days what happened with France. And I'm wondering if you have any insight into what's going on in France right now.
Well, you know, I have a great deal of affection for the French and the French military. And I think most of us in the Western world, Germans, Austrians, Danes, Dutch, Spaniards, everyone still reveres French civilization and culture as one of the highest achievements of Western civilization. And so I'm personally very concerned because what you have is something that was described many years ago in a book called Camp of the Saints. It's a situation in which people that you thought you were supposed to try and assimilate have really come to assimilate you. And so suddenly the French are fighting a very dangerous battle inside their own country for their survival as a people, as a culture, as a nation. I hope they can win that battle. And this happens when tolerance goes too far. When tolerance becomes the intolerable, you're on the path to total destruction. We are tolerating the intolerable in our cities. In 2020, we tolerated the intolerable, ostensibly because of this George Floyd business. Nobody pointed to the obvious truth that George Floyd was a repeat offender who'd gone to jail as a violent criminal and who had enough fentanyl in him at the time of his death to kill him anyway. Mm-hmm. You put these things together and, oh, well, you're a racist if you say that. No, I'm just telling you the truth. If the truth is racist, then let's have the truth. You know, let's stop pretending that the truth is ugly. You know, when the truth is ugly, only a lie could be beautiful. Well, we've had enough beautiful lies for long enough. So what happened in 2020 was a foretaste of what I think we are going to see in the future, particularly if the left discovers that it will not retain power in perpetuity. And remember the influx of all of these people that come here uninvited, unvetted, unknown. We're not talking about legal immigrants. You know, not all legal immigrants really want to be Americans either. We know that. But you have a better than 50-50 chance that if someone comes here legally and looks around, they want to be an American. That's helpful. But when you get millions of people in who are not here legally, they're not going to be Americans. And simply offering them citizenship isn't going to help. What it's going to do is dilute the meaning of your citizenship, the value of your citizenship, the importance of national identity and national cohesion. Those things will simply be swept away. So we're headed for trouble too. It's just that it struck France because France has a much higher proportion to deal with. 1 out of every 5 adults in France is a Muslim Arab, Berber, African, whatever you want to call them from the Middle East or Africa. And there's not much that can be done, obviously, to satisfy the demands of these people, because the demands most of them seem to make is that the French abase themselves, abandon themselves, their identity, their history, and essentially submit to their demands to be whatever they are. This is not the way of the world. If it becomes that way, you go out of existence. Some people would argue the Roman Empire ended largely because of these kinds of things. I'm not an expert on the ancient world. I'm sure it contributed to it. But I think is experiencing something that we're going to begin to see in Germany. We've already seen some of it in Sweden, in Denmark, Austria. The Poles have said no thank you. The Czechs have said no thank you. The Hungarians have said no thank you. Those countries have said, you're not going to come in here and test our cohesion with this nonsense. But the rest of the Europeans have largely embraced it. And I think once the globalist elites are thrown out of power, that's liable to change. Unless the Europeans collectively have decided, yes, we want to commit suicide and go out of existence. I don't think most Americans want that. But again, they haven't been heard from yet.
It's reminiscent of Douglas Murray's The Strange Death of Europe. And I think we see a lot of the same trends over here. And you mentioned that it is the globalist elite's agenda coming from the top. So I wonder what the motivation is here. What is the thinking that's driving all of this?
Well, we've already been over some of it. We talked about the Great Reset. Mm-hmm. And I think there is this sort of element that's a mixture of nihilism, Marxism, atheism, and globalism. You put them all together and you have this package that has decided the world will be converted into this amorphous mass of human beings that are all fungible, that can be employed as the great and powerful elites decide to employ them, use them, govern them. And that's what I perceive, and I think a lot of other people do as well. I don't want to live in that society. That society existed. It was the totalitarian state of Stalin. And that's not where I want to go. And I think, unfortunately, unless something is done, that's the slippery slope that you're on, because you suddenly decided to believe whatever the state says, as opposed to listening to yourself and your inner voice to tell you something very different. I give a speech once in a while privately that's called The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And I talk about atheism, nihilism, Marxism, and globalism. And I try to define each of those, and not so much in an academic sense, but in the operational sense, what the consequences of those things are, especially when they become institutionalized, which looks as though it's happening to us, does it not?
I would say it does. I use the analogy of the Four Horsemen on my podcast as well. War, famine, disease, basically the trifecta of state collapse. And we all know what comes next. It's behold the pale horse, and he who sat on him was death. And if I could perhaps squeeze one more question out of you, I appreciate you being so generous with your time. But Afghanistan is something that's kind of near and dear to our hearts around here at Veterans for Freedom. And I've been watching a lot of your stuff in preparation for this, but I haven't heard any commentary around this. So I'm very curious. It's hard to know what's going on there right now. We have some interpreters over there that we worked with through the war that haven't made their way out yet, and Canadians as well. So do you have any insight into what the current state of affairs is in Afghanistan?
I would think as a general principle for most of the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent, particularly Afghanistan, Northwest India, Pakistan. Take your hand, shove it into a bucket of water. While your hand is in the water, you displace the water. Once you remove your hand, the water returns to its former state. Those are the realities in that part of the world. A foreign entity like the United States, Canada, the NATO alliance, any group of Europeans in particular, I would say, and Americans that go into these places are not going to permanently change anything. Certainly not in a way that necessarily benefits our interests. In fact, I think you're going to get the opposite reaction. I think we're seeing blowback now. We made matters much worse by being as intrusive as we were. There's a man whose name is Sir Richard Francis Burton, very famous British author and explorer and kind of James Bond in his own right in the 19th century. And he operated all over the British Empire. And he was very successful, much more successful, I would add, than British military power in bringing on side support, allies and friends. Now, of course, the British had an advantage in one sense. They went to these places with the express purpose of extracting profit, capital, enriching themselves. They did not necessarily go in there with the goal of transforming these people into something they didn't want to become. They tried it for a short while in India. They ended up with a Sepoy rebellion, and they dropped that. We don't seem to understand that we exercise altruistic imperialism. In other words, we're imperialists, but we're very bad imperialists because we say we're here to help you. We're here to pull you out of darkness, to enlighten you, to give you all these wonderful things. We discover after a while they don't want us. Nobody wants to be ruled by a foreign entity. Nobody wants policemen in their neighborhood who don't look like them, who don't speak like them, and don't understand them. And whether or not we approve of it is irrelevant.